Okay. Are we on? Okay, hello. My name is Elaine Ribsky, and I'd like to welcome you to What Does It Mean to Defund the Police, run by women of Rodef Shalom. We do a lot of activities and sponsorships around Rodef Shalom congregation, like providing books for the libraries and fresh flowers weekly at services, sponsoring the Onegs and Kiddishes after evening and morning services, and monetarily supporting the preschool, religious school, and congregation. If you like this event and appreciate what we are doing, you can show your support by becoming a member or making a donation through the links provided in the description. Tonight, we are joined by Erika Strassburger and Dan Frankel. They will be talking about what it means to defund the police and what related actions are being taken at the local and state levels. If you have any questions for them, you can type them into the chat box and they will answer after the presentation is over. Erika Strassburger is a councilperson for the city of Pittsburgh representing the 8th District. She is the first woman to serve in this seat. She led the way on ordinances to ban assault weapons and certain firearms accessories. She passed trailblazing legislation to guard against employment discrimination for pregnant workers. She is an advocate for policies promoting clean water and air, as well as diverse communities, and committed to open and transparent government. Representative Dan Frankel has served in the state legislature for 19 years. He has been a supporter of LGBTQIA rights, worked to advance green spaces and public health, oppose efforts to limit women's health care, and expand access to health care. He has served on several boards, including but not limited to the Carnegie Library, University of Pittsburgh, McGee Research Institute, WQED Media, Jewish Family and Children's Services, and the Jewish Health Foundation. Dan and Erika, I'd like to turn it over to you now.
Thank you.
Well, thank you very much. It's great to be here. I really appreciate you you having us this evening. And I was going to start with a little bit of an overview of what's happening at the city level, but I want to let Representative Frankel also just say hello and introduce.
Oh, well, thank you, Erika, and thank you, Elaine. This is my second Zoom meeting with congregants from Rodef Shalom, and it's really a pleasure to be here with the women of Rodef Shalom, and I hope we have an interesting discussion here this evening.
Indeed, we do. So I wanted to give a little bit of context for what we've been working on at the city level before handing it over to Representative Frankel to discuss what's happening at the state level, because it's my firm belief that on policing issues, we are going to need cooperation among all levels of government. This is, although a certain amount of interest and advocacy has been directed at city governments and mayors in particular, I think, city councils for sure, we've been hearing a lot. There's a part to play by school board members and by county council members and by, of course, you know, so much happens at the state level and at the federal level as well. So I'd love to get into that discussion as well. I come at the issue of hashtag defund the police from, I think, a place that I've heard a lot of people come at it from. Now, are there people out there who believe that that the police should be entirely abolished? Sure, I think there are, but I think they're in the vast minority, and the vast majority of people are of the mindset that sure, we need to rethink what public safety means. We might need to rethink what security means. We might need to shift resources in a certain way. And that's where I stand. I mean, I think that we have turned police into social workers. We've asked them to be, to tackle issues like homelessness and addiction and trauma and untreated mental illness. And that at the same time, we have communities out there that are marginalized, that have been underinvested, that have been have experienced disinvestment or disenfranchisement. Many are majority minority communities, and we have been directing an outsized amount of resources, of public safety, policing resources into some of these communities at the expense of directing human services resources like mental health services or addiction treatment or high quality, affordable childcare that's universal, or trauma-informed care, or virus intervention programs, or investing truly in job readiness programs and education. So I think, from my perspective, when it comes to this issue, are we going to be able to solve all of those root causes of whether it's systemic racism or disinvestment by shifting resources from the police? No, but certainly some of it can come from policing budgets. And that's where I think we need to redefine what public safety means and redefine what policing can look like or should look like. And we're at a tipping point nationwide to be able to explore this issue like never before. So I'm happy to talk a little bit about what's already been introduced at the city level, but I really want to also recap a vibrant conversation that we as city council members had last Thursday at what's called a post-agenda hearing. And if you look up City Channel Pittsburgh, you'll find it on our YouTube channel. It was live streaming at the time. It's probably about 2 hours, but you could listen to it at double speed, if you know how to do that, to get through it in about an hour. And listen to a really vibrant conversation where members of public safety, members of the police, but also members of the community, advocates who've been working on police reform for years and years, spoke. And it wasn't a public hearing. They were invited guests on a panel, and then council members were able to engage and ask them questions. And what we got into was the fact that, the new bureau of community safety, community health and safety, I believe is what it's called, from the mayor's office, is really working night and day to figure out how we shift resources from the police into that new bureau, which will not be under the public safety. It'll be a completely new department. And it will house the social workers who can perhaps one day respond to 911 calls, if not this next year, one day eventually be able to respond to 911 calls where a 911 operator could take a call, assess whether it's, say, a mental health emergency, and send a social worker out to address this emergency rather than a police officer, someone who might be better equipped to de-escalate and keep that person out of jail. We know that these kind of programs work because there's a 30-year track record in Eugene, Oregon, for instance, with a program called Cahoots, which, yes, has had 30 years to mature, but has also proven to be successful. Last year, they took 20% of the 911 calls in that region. And that is, those are calls that then the police didn't have to take. And that's also much less expensive than paying police officers to take those calls, and keeps people out of the revolving door of incarceration. It's financially prudent, but more importantly, it's one example of getting to the root causes of what plagues our community, and really truly prioritizing health and security and safety in our communities. The same goes for how we address homelessness. Do we call, our only option right now, if a store owner calls 911 on someone who is panhandling or asking for money outside of a store and they don't want them there, the police show up and they are told to move along, and they move maybe 3 blocks down the street. Is that really getting to the root cause of the issue, or are there other ways? We know there are other ways. If the person is homeless by choice, okay, that's fine. If the person is not homeless by choice, we need to invest in more programs to house them and to find them then permanent housing. And in the case of people who might be experiencing addiction and want to get clean, housing is the first thing that they need as harm reduction to be able to get clean. So in addition to lots of other interventions. So this is kind of what I think a lot of us here at the city are thinking about and wanting to get to very quickly. I've been researching a lot, like a lot of people these days. I've been learning a lot. I will admit that this is an issue I sort of knew peripherally before this, but have not been working on for 10 years or 20 years like some people have. And, you know, there are many different problems, many different solutions. But it's really going to come down to how what we prioritize in the budget each year. And we're just about to initiate in the fall time our process to figure out the 2021 budget. And while we don't have a whole lot of power to do a whole lot about police discipline or about, you know, what police we fire or hire, well, what we hire we can control, but who we fire we can't always control, you know, a number of other reforms, we can control the purse strings and what we invest in. So that's where a lot of this is going to this discussion is going to happen. I also want to mention, though, that there are some bills that have been introduced already by Reverend Burgess and Councilman Lavelle that include getting at some of the initial conversation around, you know, capping the amount that we spend on public safety and police. One is a hiring freeze, which is one of the few ways we actually can control how much we spend, because so much of policing at the local level is dictated by their labor union contracts and arbitration that the city and the union go into each year. So we can control how many police officers we hire. We cannot control their salary, but a hiring freeze is one thing that's been proposed for a period of time. Redirecting $250,000 this year into a Stop the Violence fund that will go from now until 2026, ramping up to 10% of the budget towards the Stop the Violence fund by 2026. Banning the acquisition of surplus military equipment, requiring officer intervention. This is already police policy, but this would codify it. So if one police officer noticed another police officer violating someone's constitutional rights, they would be required by law to intervene. And banning chokeholds and other types of harmful detaining tactics and techniques, again, already outlined in police policy, the police bureau's policy, but this would codify it. So those are a few things that have already been introduced, along with putting a referendum question on November's ballot for voters to be able to vote on, to sort of increase the powers of the Community Police Review Board, which has been around for about 20 years, and require that before any disciplinary action is taken by the mayor or the police chief, that they would have to go through that process. Right now, it's not mandatory. So most likely voters will see that on the polls this November. I'll speak very briefly about some of the powers we don't have, and I alluded to this before, but one of the powers we don't have at the City Council has to do with discipline. And there have actually been cases where the city of Pittsburgh has fired a police officer for sort of, you know, 3 strikes you're out type of activity and bad behavior. It went to arbitration, and a 3-panel arbitrators panel found that ruled that the city must rehire this officer. When the city tried to put them on desk duty, it went to arbitration again. Essentially, the city was sued again, and then the arbitration panel actually ruled that we had to not put him on desk duty, but rehire him and put him back on the streets. And that is something that is really hard for me to swallow. I mean, that is the fact that we don't even have the power to take discipline where necessary is really difficult. There are a number of reforms aside from what I've already discussed that perhaps, you know, the city of Pittsburgh could very well pass and implement. And, you know, I'd say that there's clearly not enough been done so far, but the city of Pittsburgh has done quite a bit compared to, you know, those that have smaller police forces, or, you know, maybe less money to be able to send their police officers to training. And yet our police powers end at the borders of this city. And so really to make change that will expand beyond, into the suburbs and into East Pittsburgh, into, Baldwin Borough, either those municipalities need to take action or we need state level. And so that's where it's incredibly important to see some of the action that has been moving forward, I think, more quickly out of the State House that I've been really pleased to see move for the first time in a long time. So I think I'll pause there, and I'd be happy to get into more questions and answers later, but I'll pass that along to the representative to talk a little bit more about what Representative Frankel's been doing with his colleagues in Harrisburg.
Thank you, Erika. First of all, I want to thank Erika and City Council and the Mayor for all the work that they're doing to try and address this issue. It's been around for a long time, and it's finally being aired out in a way that I think we can really promote significant, meaningful, and lasting change and bring real justice to our communities. I want to really agree also with Erika on one of the things that has taken place here steadily over the years that I've been in the legislature and even preceding me, and that is, moving over to law enforcement and our police responsibilities that really don't belong there. Dealing with homelessness, dealing with minor infractions, dealing with mental health issues in our communities, which is really very much a function of how we funded our budgets over the years and redirected money away from human services and the social safety net to basically funding incarceration and law enforcement. And what we've seen is, as you take a look at our budgets over all these years, is our corrections budget has gone up by double digits every single year I've been here. We've incarcerated more and more people, though we're starting to reverse that trend. We've made our statements with respect to mandatory minimum sentencing. So we've taken away discretion from judges that basically are unable to take a look at circumstances within somebody who's brought before them on charges and taken away their ability to pass a fair sentence to people. And we've given prosecutors way too much power, and they have very often abused it in order to basically get levels of convictions that may not be justified. Give them leverage in that environment. I would say that one of the things we need to look at, when I talk about defunding the police, I think I have one perspective, and I think there are multiple perspectives of what that means. But I don't think anybody is, or very few people are talking about eliminating police. The fact of the matter is, I think we need police to be dealing with violent crime. And violent crime really affects our inner cities and our minority communities most intimately. And I just think if you talk to most African Americans, they don't want to abandon that practice. But the fact of the matter is that much of policing is dealing with minor infractions and misdemeanors that end up creating many more problems down the road when somebody's arrested. And you take a look at what happened with George Floyd. George Floyd was suspected of passing a $20 counterfeit bill, and ended up being violently assaulted by police in that effort. You take a look at Eric Gardner selling cigarettes illegally. These are not violations, even if they were accurate, that merit this type of response by law enforcement, or should result, I think, ultimately in somebody being arrested and prosecuted. I think there are different ways to handle this, because what you have in this environment is a spiraling effect that somebody who gets arrested, particularly in a minority community, ends up having a difficult time getting a job, buying a house, renting a place, getting credit, All these things create a spiraling effect that perpetuate poverty and disorder in our communities, and there is a different way to respond to it. 13 million people are charged with misdemeanors each year in our country, and 50% of Black males will be arrested by the time they're 23 years old, most of them for a misdemeanor, and that becomes a life-changing event. And we incentivize police and prosecutors to go after folks for these minor offenses. And one of the most significant ones that we're dealing with is marijuana use in minor possession of minor amounts of marijuana. We need to address that issue. That's responsible, and I'm looking for this thing. You know, arrests for Pennsylvania in particular ranks 36th in the nation for the largest racial disparities in arrests in marijuana possession. And African Americans were 3 times more likely than white people to be arrested for marijuana possession. So we have an opportunity to change that fundamental thing, and I think there is some momentum to that. My colleague Jake Wheatley from the city of Pittsburgh is a prime sponsor of the legalization of recreational marijuana. There are other bills to decriminalize. It would go a long way to solving this problem. I think we have to start shifting resources. It makes no sense to be dedicating so much state, federal, and local money to dealing with minor offenses like this, and to be continually funding, a criminal justice system that is dysfunctional and creating long-term problems in our communities. So we're working along those lines. I would say, on a positive note, in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder, we have significant, for the first time in my 22 years, it's not 19 years, it's actually 22 years, in the legislature, I think we're seeing significant movement on not just criminal justice reform, but police reform in the legislature. Several weeks ago, my colleagues in the Legislative Black Caucus, which include 4 members of the Allegheny County Democratic delegation, Summer Lee, Ed Gainey, Jake Wheatley, and Austin Davis, did something I've never seen take place before, and I think was unprecedented. And to some, they've been shocking. They took over the speaker's desk in the General Assembly, and they took over the dais and unfurled a flag, Black Lives Matter, and all of us, Democrats and Republicans, were sitting there. Speaker Turzai was sitting there, and we listened to remarks from each one of my colleagues from the Legislative Black Caucus about both their experiences, the experiences of their constituencies, and the need for change in the aftermath of the George Floyd murder. There was a negotiation that took place after that, led by the Legislative Black Caucus with Republican leaders, and included our Democratic leaders as well, that resulted in an agreement to move 2 pieces of legislation that, while incremental, I still think stand as a significant symbol of progress that is taking place. There's a lot more to do, but just to let you know, what we did get done and has been signed into law are 2 pieces of legislation that came out of the House, sponsored by my colleagues. One that will ensure that police employment records, including actions and firings, will be kept in a database that police departments must check before hiring an officer. As many of you know, the officer who was charged with murdering Antoine Rose had a record that should not have allowed him to have been hired by the police department he was hired by. In addition to that, we have a bill, HB 1910, that to require enhanced training for police officers on how to treat people of diverse racial, ethnic, and economic backgrounds. And it also requires police to take a PTSD test every 2 years or within 30 days of the last time that they may have exerted lethal force. Those bills passed unanimously in both chambers. And I can't tell you that that would have happened several months ago. I think it was a uniquely different environment and bipartisanship involved in getting those things done. And the governor signed them into law, I think, last week. We have about 18 other pieces of legislation that we need to get done. And I won't say that they are equally as fast-tracked, everything from chokeholds to transparency with respect to a number of policing issues. They keep track of the use of force of all incidents, increase the level of legal accountability that police officers face, because one of the things that we know is they have a level of immunity that basically would encourage or facilitate acts of violence against individuals in our community. So we're making some progress along those lines. We have a lot more to do. We need to work closely and listen to our local elected officials and really empower them to be able to do things. Unfortunately, as we know, particularly with respect to gun laws in our state, which is another issue that impacts our communities, and particularly minority communities and distressed communities in our cities, is that guns are all too prevalent. And we have basically handcuffed our local elected officials like Erika, who's been working so hard to pass common sense gun laws in our communities that would go a long way to creating a sense of safety and a reality of safety in our communities. So we still have work to do there. I'm going to stop there to give people a chance to comment or to weigh in with some questions.
Thank you, Dan and Erika. We do have quite a few questions already, so I'll just start at the beginning. First question is, what would the Stop the Violence fund money go towards?
So from what I understand, it would go toward the Stop the Violence initiative, which was announced sort of under a new name in 2018, introduced by council members Reverend Burgess and Daniel LaBelle. They were introduced in concert with some of the gun sense legislation that Councilman O'Connor and I had introduced and worked on together. That was specifically about guns themselves and firearms. This was about a sort of a larger systemic Stop the Violence initiative. And the aim there is to pull together multiple agencies like the Allegheny County Health Department and Human Services and Public Safety to treat gun violence as the public health crisis that it actually is. And so one sort of really successful, I wouldn't just call it a rebranding because it's a reinvention of a program that was doing some good work but has been improved since then, is called the Group Violence Intervention. And that actually trains civilians, so not police officers, but hires civilians to work part-time, some of them formerly incarcerated, some of them former gang members, to do violence intervention. Some of it is, when we have evidence that there's been violence against one gang, to intervene before there is violence, against another gang as retaliation. And it has been effective, but it's also been effective at sort of a trust building. It's almost like community policing, but without the actual police. It's civilians who are doing this work. And it's pretty amazing to hear the work that they do day in and day out. I mean, and they are doing work of social workers. I mean, they're doing work that social workers could be doing and probably should be doing. And they're not trained as social workers, but they're doing all the right things because they're embedded in the community. They're from a community where they're volunteering, or they're not volunteering, where they're getting paid to do some work. So that's one example of kind of a part of the Stop the Violence initiative. I think it probably could do more if it were funded more. So I do support that legislation.
The next question is from Kimberly. She asks, is there any move to bar the police from raising the defense of qualified immunity in a civil rights action brought against an officer for use of excessive force or failure to intervene?
Well, as I mentioned before, we do have a piece of legislation. I can get some more detail about it in terms of the bill number. I know Daphne in my office is online. Maybe she can forward that information. But we do have a piece of legislation that to keep track of all use of force incidents and increase the level of legal accountability that police officers face. So to remove, I'm not sure to the extent of which we're removing liability or imposing liability, I would say, on officers to create more accountability, but there is a piece of legislation to do that.
Okay, and a related question from Andy, is anyone writing a referendum for November?
So on the bill that I mentioned, there are a couple of ways a referendum, a ballot initiative can end up on the ballot in November. One is through a community effort to get enough petition signatures to allow for the language that you are signing a petition for, that exact language to appear on that election's ballot. Another is for actually city council to pass a bill to allow that to happen. And that is the way that Reverend Burgess is structuring this, so that city council will pass a bill for this community, the CPRB amendment legislation and strengthening legislation to actually be on the ballot in November. So that's actually going to be, we just had the public hearing. We have so many public hearings and post-agenda hearings, but I think we just had that last week. So I think that will be discussed Wednesday for potential final action on Tuesday. And anyone who's interested in learning more about that, because it is really important and you're going to be voting on it, I urge them to contact me, look up my name in District 8 City Council, and you can find my email address there. And on the previous question, I also want to note that qualified immunity is one of those issues that will have to be, there is the issue that Representative Frankel talked about, but qualified immunity itself is a federal issue that members of Congress, such as those, here in Western Pennsylvania, are supportive of and are trying to end in a certain way. And I don't have the updated information as to how far it's gotten in the House or in the Senate, but I know that there are a number of bills to address that.
Next question is from William. Is the police contract governed by labor law statutes at local, state, or federal levels?
Well, we have Act 111 that basically provides for the system of arbitration that is engaging, police, city officials in order to create, the contract that they operate on, both in terms of compensation and benefits, and also with respect to responsibilities that and accountability issues that we have. And we have not modified it. It's always been weighted. The system is weighted in a way that gives police extraordinary leverage in that negotiation with our local elected officials. And I know it's been an issue for a very long time. I will tell you that the FOP has, across the state, has enormous influence, both on a bipartisan basis. There's been legislation introduced over the years, including in this session of the legislature, to modify that arrangement and to create a fair negotiating ground for folks. But it has not moved. It has not moved in my 20 years in the legislature. And I know, but talking to Erika, that this is an issue of great frustration for city council, at least some city council members and the mayor, in terms of their ability to negotiate just not a fair wage and benefit agreement, but fair issues with respect to police accountability, police behavior, and the ability for the city to hold individual police accountable for actions that may go beyond the pale.
Thank you. Paul asks, would reallocating funds from the police also lead to less unequal policing of Black communities?
I'll take that first. I don't think it can happen by itself. You need both. You need, if you only say defund the police, let's say you defunded the police and just abolished the police without doing anything else. I don't believe that would help anything. You need strategic, I think we should stop talking about defunding the police and start talking about strategic investment in communities in a way that truly gets at the root causes of violence, of the feeling of hopelessness that can cause addiction, that can cause so many other kind of negative health outcomes, and reduce the feeling of public safety. So do I think that there is a way to divert funds from policing to some of these programs? Yes, but it's also going to take an increase in investment from other sources in other ways. I mean, one thing that's tough that I've learned about being a legislator is that money just doesn't come from anywhere. You have to make tough choices. And if you're funding something, it has to come from somewhere else. So where does that somewhere else come from? And that's where I think we're going to be in a time when the city's budget is down a quarter to a third in terms of revenue because of COVID and the pandemic. We're going to have to be having to make some tough choices anyway this budget season. But in particular, we need to do it through an equity lens to make up for past I think discriminatory, and I'm talking from decades and decades ago, discriminatory practices and budgeting choices that were made and policy choices. So the key is investing in the things that matter that will help right some of those past wrongs.
Yeah, I don't think that most people, when they talk about defunding police, are talking about eliminating police or zeroing out police budgets. I think that that's a very small minority of the folks talking about it. I do think it's about reimagining how policing ought to take place, reallocating resources, as Erika said, to folks who ought to be maybe more appropriate at intervening in certain situations like domestic disputes, like mental health crises that we have police operating on now. We ought to be funding human services, social workers, to do the work that is much more appropriate to treating people who are subject of being arrested and prosecuted and probably be much more effective.
Dan, I think we lost you here. Your screen seems frozen. Next question, hopefully he'll rejoin us soon. Jeff has a hypothetical. What if a person is accused of or convicted for shoplifting for the umpteenth time? Diversionary programs are preferable to wasting court resources, but how many times and for how long?
I'm not an expert in these types of programs. My gut tells me, and I'm sorry that this isn't backed up by science and evidence, but it tells me that diversionary program just isn't structured very well, or isn't working. It needs to be overhauled if it's not working. So, what is then causing that person to continue to shoplift? Is it a pathology, or is it that they need money for drugs, or is it addiction? Do they need to be treated? Do they need to be treated in a certain way? What is causing that? And I think that's what we need to drill down into and approach people in a very human way. There are people who I know much more about these types of programs and have seen it succeed in other places. Is that to say that there's no place for for taking violent, dangerous criminals out of the public sphere? No, I mean, there is a place for that, but I think the vast majority who are in our jails and in our prisons, if we had tackled it in a different way, in a really difficult to do, but ultimately better way that we could be not only seeing those people be, citizens, free citizens out in the world and perhaps leading productive lives, but also saving our governments a whole lot of money too. So I think there are a lot of different ways to look at these types of programs that might take a little bit more on the front end, but can save us in a whole lot of ways in the back end.
Okay. The next question I think is specific for Dan, so we'll have to wait until he rejoins us. After that, CJ asks, what can be done at your level regarding rampant racism within the police force?
Yeah, that gets into something that I've talked to a couple of council members about, and that is about standards for hiring. And I don't think there's one single answer for that, but certainly it can't just be about, getting rid of the so-called bad apples. There needs to be a whole systemic change and redefining of what it means to be an officer and what it means to be what it means to serve in that way. There are a couple of very specific things that I've heard that seem like good ideas. For instance, not giving, currently I think we give bonus points. This wasn't even the idea of the police. I don't know who came up with this, but giving bonus points to those who have served in the military. Maybe bonus points should come if you have, a degree in a relevant field like sociology or social work instead of military service. Just thinking about some of the situations you might be in. Do we really want people to be trained in, sort of have a military background when they're faced with a protest situation, or do we want people who are thinking about public safety in a sort of public health mentality? But change has to come not just from the top, but it has to come from within the ranks. And I was talking to friends who think about implementation science. Even in other fields, when you're talking about a change to, say, the way a surgeon should do a procedure, it can take 15 to 20 years for that to actually become common practice with surgeons across the country. So the same is true in any kind of field, like in policing. You could say, you could have the best mayor and the best police chief, and they can be saying one thing, and it takes just consistency and smart hiring to be able to see that kind of play out throughout, all levels of that body. And the difficulty, I think it's impossible, but the difficulty is that you see, if this is we're in a political system, and so you see people at the top changing power every so often and changing priorities, but you really need that consistency throughout over time to be able to see any kind of change throughout the ranks as well. But I do think that hiring and smart hiring and then having more control over our discipline would go a long way pretty quickly.
Okay, Dan, here's one for you. Why did your colleagues from the Black Caucus have to take such forceful actions to get their voices heard? Why is it not easier for Black voices and experiences to be heard in the chamber?
Well, I wish it were different. And I think what we've seen happen across this country is not just unique to Pennsylvania, is that we've gotten the attention of this country in a way that we should have done it years ago. But the excessive use of force, the deaths and murders of African-American men over the last several years, I think has finally come to the fore and garnered the kind of attention and passion for change that we have not seen before. So it has become almost impossible for my colleagues to turn away from this, even those who have been, I think, ardent supporters or opponents of criminal justice reform for years and years and years. So I think on one hand, it took some time to get here. I wouldn't say we've arrived by any stretch of the imagination. I think they took two pieces of the legislation that, while meaningful, were not exactly earth-shattering accomplishments that my colleagues are grateful for the support for, but have made it very clear there is much more work to be done. And I think if we take a look at the top priority for many of us, including the Legislative Black Caucus, it is really moving forward. We want to make sure that I think one of the pieces of legislation that we've been prioritizing is a bill that would limit the circumstances in which deadly force can be used. I think that's been probably, if you pick the top legislative priority of the Legislative Black Caucus and my colleagues here, my African-American colleagues here in Pittsburgh, that would be the bill that they would choose to get done. I'm sure that they tried to negotiate getting that to the table, but there was resistance to moving that bill. So progress has been made. It's insufficient. There's more to be done. And I'm hoping that that'll be a conversation that is intimately involved as we go into this November election at every level of government, at every level of this election process that comes up, that we have to answer to where we stand on some of these positions, and legislators should be held accountable to that. I think that's the way we're going to get change done, and I think the momentum is there. I am heartened because of the persistence of the protests that have lasted and have continued to garner and rivet this country. So I think change is in the air, and we'll see how it plays out. But there's more work to be done.
Thank you. Next question, how are you putting pressure on your colleagues who do not support defunding the police and Black Lives Matter? One thing driving the conversation is the vociferous protests. One thing forcing the issue. How are you forcing the issue among those who have the power to implement change?
Well, I would say that part of what taking place is really riding on the energy that we've seen take place in the community. I think people can't turn away and give us the same old answers, I think it's got to play out the way you change the hearts and minds of legislators, most of us, is at the ballot box. And when we feel threatened, you usually get a response. I've seen this take place on the other side of the equation. The reason the NRA is so effective in inhibiting the ability to pass common sense gun legislation is because they scare the hell out of most of my colleagues, and it's impossible to overcome it. That's beginning to change, but that's still, again, a work in progress. So we have to use the tools that we have in civil disobedience and at the ballot box, and we're seeing that play out in a way that I think is really unprecedented in our country in these last few months, and hopefully will play out in the next few months as we head towards November.
And I'll just add to that and say that I speak out. I speak out whenever I have a chance with my colleagues who are present, when I have the opportunity to talk to them. There are some who just won't, they're not gettable on the merits of the issue, so they need more. And let me just say, I have not acknowledged this yet, but let me just say that the protests have been an incredible motivator, as Representative Frankel said. And the protests are not just this moment. They're not just coming about all of a sudden this moment. This is credit to, I credit Black leaders, Black women in particular who have been on the front lines of Black Lives Matter and organizing these kind of protests for years and years and years and decades. And there are a lot of white folks who are waking up for the first time or waking up after a long dormancy and joining. And I know that there is, if you feel comfortable getting out into the streets and standing with your Black brothers and sisters, I hear from people who are Black who say, thank you for doing that. I mean, to white folks in general, thank you for being out there because we're tired. We've been out there for decades. We're tired, and we thank you for giving us a little bit of opportunity to rest. So, whatever you can do, if it's standing, safely with your mask on out in a protest, that's one way. But I have to also say that I've never gotten so many emails at once than when I got the Defund 12, Defund the Police emails over a course of 5 days, where I think it's up to about 3,800 emails I've now put into that folder, in my email address or in my email folder. At a certain point, there's 3 per minute that were coming in. And even though I knew that some of them didn't live in Pittsburgh, they might not have even lived in the region or the state, that spoke to council members. I mean, that went to every council member, our chief of staff, and to the mayor. So, emails, handwritten, heartfelt emails, phone calls, letters aren't really getting through to everyone right now unless you have home addresses because everyone's working from home. But heartfelt emails or emails in massive numbers are really do make a difference as well.
Next, I think is for Erika. What would you hope Pittsburgh's neighboring communities are doing to help progress in Allegheny County and in the city?
Yeah, there's only so much that Allegheny County Council can do, unfortunately. And I would love to work, have our council members and our, whoever can work together with other neighboring communities or others outside of Pittsburgh within Allegheny County to, well, I think what needs to happen is we need a cohesive and coherent system that works regardless of where you are, so that it's not a patchwork of policies and procedures that make up policing across the United States. And I really think it has to happen at the federal level, but absent that right now, we can do what we can do at the city level and then try to export that as best we can, working with our council colleagues in neighboring boroughs and townships as best we can.
Okay, next question. One motivation Black people have expressed for their demand to defund the police is not just a more efficient allocation of resources, but rather their lived experience that they would be safer without police in their communities due to the racism embedded in the policing system we have. You're talking about reform. How do you reform the racism out?
I think, part of it's going to be how we hire police and how we train police. But I don't think that I think people in African-American communities in our neighborhoods don't want to eliminate police. I think they want to have police that provide the same protections and discretion that white communities have, to be treated in the same way, and not to have this level of violence and clear discrimination that's taking place in the way laws, particularly as I talked about, misdemeanor violations are prosecuted. I mean, you just don't see it happen in white communities. The level of prosecutions for marijuana possession, for disorderly conduct, for drunkenness, for things that end up escalating into the situations that we've seen with George Floyd and others, and also end up in resulting in incarceration where white folks aren't going to be subjected to that level of things. I think people want a level playing ground. And as I've said, the level of violent crime is an epidemic in many of these communities. And I think that if you talk to many African Americans, they just want the policing that the rest of us have, and the discretion and the fairness that the rest of us have. So a lot of that means we've got to reallocate resources and think about policing in a different way to deal with the issues that police are dealing with that result in this unfair imbalance where people are prosecuted and arrested and have their lives changed forever because of minor violations that those of us in Squirrel Hill and Shadyside typically don't have to worry about.
And I think that was, I completely agree. And I think that is because policing, as we know it in America, is based off of a system that protects white people and white property. And so, Doug, I agree with you that it can't just be tinkering around the edges, and it can't just be strategic or more efficient allocation of resources. It has to be a total overhaul of how we define public safety and how we define what policing is for, so that we are no longer operating in that sort of systemically racist way. I think this is the moment we can do it. And if we miss it, then we've missed a real opportunity to really get at a troubling aspect of our country's history and fix it.
And I also want to say that policing is one element of this. I mean, we need to deal with reining in prosecutors that have, I think, run rogue in terms of the way that they handle many of these situations. And we need to continue to eliminate mandatory minimum sentencing, give judges discretion, and we need to make the kinds of investments in our human service agencies and the social safety net that will prevent the kind of spiral that we see in many individuals that get mixed up in the criminal justice system. We need to deal with bail requirements that create again problems for people who aren't able to post bail and end up sitting in jail forever, losing their jobs, losing their ability to make a living, to have a home, losing their homes, losing their driver's licenses. There's so many aspects to this, and policing is a huge part of it, as we've seen play out, where people's lives are at stake, physically at stake, but we have people's lives that are permanently impacted because of the unfairness of the criminal justice system. So we need to be on two tracks addressing that. And I know that we've made some progress on criminal justice reform as well at the state level, but we have so much more to do. It's one of the few areas actually that there has been, at least on a national level, I want to say here in Pennsylvania, some bipartisanship in terms of working towards reforming the criminal justice system. Though I think under the Trump administration, that bipartisanship has been set aside. But I do think once we get past this era, that we can go back and work together on what was a common goal, admittedly for different reasons between conservatives and progressives. But there was agreement that we needed to do criminal justice reform. And that would also go, I think, a long way to improving the lives of everybody, and particularly in these minority communities that have been so impacted by levels of incarceration and abuse in our criminal justice system.
Next question is, if you reimagine policing to send out social workers, et cetera, for domestics, how are they supposed to deal with the violence that so often occurs during them? These tend to be among the most dangerous calls that police and EMS and fire respond to.
Yeah, it has to be done right. So that's a short answer. It has to be done right. And I'm not the one to determine who goes up for what kind of call. I understand that domestics can be very, very volatile. So maybe you don't send the social worker out to that, or you send the EMS and social worker person, who's hired along with them in case there's an opportunity for de-escalation. But you train people, you train the callers, those receiving the calls, to send out the appropriate person, and if they need backup, they get backup, and if they don't need backup, then you've saved a police officer from having to respond to a certain case. I'll also say there are a lot of different models here. It's not just the one I mentioned. Toronto has a model that is where there are people who are actually embedded within the police, similar to, I think, Oakland, California as well. They actually are trained police officers. They show up in, a polo shirt or in sweats rather than a full police uniform. And they are specifically trained. I mean, they have that social work background, but they're specifically trained in de-escalation. That is their training. That is their forte. And that's what they do. And so, can they do what a police officer can do? Yes, but they are trained to do everything else first. And I know one person, actually a former city council member, who witnessed that himself and just stayed and watched for 2 hours while someone in Toronto, responded in that way to a serious sort of mental health emergency in the middle of the street, and was in awe, and has connected me with the people in Toronto to talk to a little bit. And lots of different models out there. Sweden has a different model as well. So that's what we want to look at.
This next question refers to the bonus points that you mentioned earlier, Erika. Wendy says, these bonus points are civil service rules, I believe, and this is not changeable on the local level. Am I mistaken?
No, that's what I understand as well.
Okay. Next question. What can we do to help push changes through besides vote?
The advocacy work that I think many people probably on this call do all the time. Communicate with your legislators. Go to see them individually. I mean, one of the things at both at the state and local level is that people have an opportunity to have an intimate relationship in terms of being able to have access to somebody that you might not have at the federal level. I mean, I know that in my office, if you want to meet with me, it may not happen instantaneously, but you'll get a meeting with me, or you get a phone call returned. I think advocacy is one of the most important things that folks can be doing, and it's more than pressing a computer button and sending a canned email. I mean, that's somewhat helpful, but not terribly helpful. But having that communication. Now, one of the things that we have to do is to be able to get outside of what I call the East End bubble, because you're talking on many of these issues to people who tend to agree with you. So we need to be able to extend our advocacy efforts to legislative districts and communities that may not be so inclined or so receptive at the end of the day. And a lot of that really does play out. It's a combination of the advocacy work, making sure elected officials are aware of what priorities are, and then holding them accountable through the electoral process. I think that's the only way you can affect change.
Okay, thank you. Well, there don't seem to be any more questions. There's some discussion on the Facebook page, but I think we're out of questions for now. So I want to thank you both for coming. This has been very enjoyable and educational. And I hope that everyone reaches out to you to see, what they can do to help, and that we get some good things moving quickly.
My office would be pleased to work with anybody on this call and many others. And I know, Erika and I work very hard to do the constituent work that is so important to our offices, and part of that is talking about these issues and listening to you folks about what's important to you and what we should be doing and working on.
Yeah, likewise. Please reach out to me any way you want: phone, email, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, and thank you so much for having us again on this forum. It's been a pleasure, and it allowed me to learn a little bit more about what's happening at the state level as well. So that was helpful.
Thanks,
All right.
everybody.
Thank you. We hope to see you soon.
All right, take care. Bye-bye.
Bye.